Have you ever felt like loyalty doesn't mean much anymore? At 51, Diane McCarthy had built her entire life around one word: stability. A single mother living in Columbus, Ohio, Diane had worked in the HR department at Orion Tech Solutions for over 22 years. She wasn't flashy. She didn't need the spotlight. But she understood people better than anyone. Diane could remember coworkers' birthdays without a calendar. She knew how to mediate tense negotiations between the union and upper management. And she had trained nearly every department head still working at the company. Diane wasn't just another employee, she was the quiet backbone of the organization. Her office was small and tidy, with a framed photo of her daughter, Emily, at graduation and a fern she'd kept alive for almost a decade with quiet, careful love. Every morning, she arrived before 8 a.m. with her own coffee thermos and was often the last to leave, whether it was to comfort an employee crying over a payroll error or to help a new hire get settled. She wasn't chasing promotions. All she wanted was to do her job well, put her daughter through college, and retire at 65. Then the new leadership arrived. The board hired a man named Jared Langston, 38, from California, with a finance background and a passion for words like innovation, transformation, and optimization. Jared came in like a cold front, restructuring the company, replacing department heads with his people, and turning company-wide meetings into TED Talk-style lectures instead of real updates. Diane watched as the company culture shifted, piece by piece. Loyalty was replaced by KPIs. Empathy gave way to Excel spreadsheets. She offered feedback, gently, sincerely, but all she got back were empty stares and polite nods. One morning, she found herself removed from a meeting she had organized for the past 10 years. The next day, Jared introduced a new HR director, without even informing her. And then came the meeting. It was shockingly brief. Jared leaned back in his chair, casually glancing at a folder. "Diane, we appreciate your years of service, but the company is moving in a new direction. Your mindset no longer aligns with where we're headed. It's outdated." Diane sat frozen. After everything, after decades of dedication, of training, of quiet sacrifice, she was being dismissed, not for doing anything wrong, but for being obsolete. What Jared didn't know, what no one knew, was that Diane held some of the company's most sensitive information. Not because she snooped or pried, but because it had once been her job. Internal complaints, executive misconduct, shady contracts, leadership's private notes. She still had contacts in the local union, city government, and 2 executives at a rival firm who owed her favors. That day, Diane walked out of the building not in shame, but with a folder in her bag and a fire burning in her chest. They thought she was done. They had no idea she was just getting started. After the termination, Diane returned to her modest ranch-style home in Grove City, a quiet suburb about 20 minutes outside downtown Columbus. The single-story house, with its front porch and small lawn, had always been a place of comfort after long workdays. But that day, the air felt heavy, still, empty. She made herself a cup of coffee, not the kind she brought to the office every morning, but a cheap, budget-friendly brand she kept around, just in case. Emily, her daughter, had just graduated from Ohio State, still job hunting, still living at home to save money. Both mother and daughter found themselves at life's crossroads. "You okay, Mom?" Emily asked, seeing her sitting motionless at the kitchen table. Diane nodded slowly, but inside, she was tangled in a knot of fear and confusion. At 51, her resume would be tossed out by recruiters the second they saw her age. Tech companies were chasing young talent, people fluent in data analytics and AI tools. She wasn't stupid, but she knew the world had changed and she'd been left behind. A week later, she applied to 3 senior HR roles. No callbacks. One recruiter even wrote back bluntly, "We're looking for candidates with innovative thinking and startup energy." It felt like a punch to the gut. No one wanted her anymore. But Diane wasn't ready to fold. One afternoon, while organizing old paperwork, she opened a drawer where she used to keep sensitive files from her days at Orion. It was a habit. Every issue she handled had a backup copy, handwritten notes, and a contact list. Everything from off-the-record hiring contracts to engineers' complaints about illegal overtime, it was all still there. And then a thought struck her, sharp and electric. If they think I'm outdated, they have no idea what I've seen, what I know, or what I can do. Diane picked up an old phone and scrolled through her contacts. A familiar name. Lawrence Becker, the former exec at a rising software company, now preparing to expand into the Midwest. She texted, "Larry, I think it's time we talked. I have an idea and a client list you might want to see." Within 10 minutes, her phone rang. Larry's voice on the line, part excited, part cautious. "Diane, I heard what happened. So what are you thinking?" For the first time in weeks, Diane smiled. "Larry, I'm not looking for a job. I'm starting a company." That call with Larry wasn't just a conversation, it was a declaration of war. 3 days later, Diane sat in a small cafe in downtown Columbus, a grid-lined notebook in front of her with a rough business plan. Across the table was Lawrence Becker, her longtime collaborator from a past joint HR transformation project, now interim CEO of a fast-growing HR software startup called Talent Forge. Larry was looking to expand in the Midwest. "What exactly are you trying to do?" he asked. Diane slid the notebook across the table. "Start an independent HR consulting firm. Not like those bloated agencies with buzzwords and sky-high quotes. I want to take back every client Orion has, every contract, every relationship." Larry flipped through the pages. No frills. Just a straightforward list. Mid-sized companies currently using Orion's HR services, detailed notes on the issues they'd raised, and the solutions Diane had once proposed, only to be ignored by the new leadership. "You kept all of this?" he asked, half impressed, half wary. "It's not about revenge," Diane said firmly. "It's about proving I was never outdated. And I know how to do this, better, smarter, and with integrity." Larry sat in silence for a moment, then sighed. Talent Forge is rolling out a new software package that integrates HR data and performance analytics. If you can help me land at least 3 major clients in Ohio next quarter, I'll fund your company and make it an official strategic partner. Diane nodded. "Give me 6 weeks." She went home, opened her laptop, and created the first Excel file for her new venture. The file name, Phoenix HR, Rebuild Planned, XLSX. No office, no team, no marketing budget. Just a 51-year-old woman, a beat-up Toyota Camry, and 2 decades of hard-earned experience no textbook could teach. Diane started making calls, sending emails, setting up coffee meetings with former HR managers, people she'd supported through some of their toughest moments. She wasn't selling software. She was selling trust, empathy, ground-level expertise only someone once discarded as obsolete could offer. A month later, Phoenix HR signed its first contract with a manufacturing company in Dayton that used to be an Orion client, now fed up with lifeless spreadsheets and AI-driven consulting. By the second month, the third company had signed on. And in week 6, Diane got an email from Larry. "Congratulations, official strategic partner of Talent Forge." She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the Phoenix HR logo on the screen, then looked up at her daughter, who was making coffee. "I'm rebuilding my life," she said, half joking. Emily laughed. "You're not rebuilding, Mom, you're upgrading." The following spring, in a small rented office above a bakery in Upper Arlington, a suburb just west of Columbus, the name Phoenix HR appeared on a sign for the first time. It wasn't a flashy HQ, just 2 desks, an old printer, and shaky Wi-Fi, but to Diane, it was the start of something bigger than success, freedom. No one called her outdated anymore. No more pitying looks when she spoke up in meetings. Here, Every decision was hers, and every morning, Diane sat down with a clear goal: to win back the clients Orion had captured through reputation, but was now losing due to a lack of genuine connection. She launched a three-pronged strategy. 1. Rebuild old relationships. Diane hand-wrote letters to former partners, not templated emails, but personal notes that recalled past conversations, shared challenges, and a warm invitation to reconnect over coffee. She wasn't selling anything. She was reigniting trust. 2. Offer services that actually fit. Phoenix HR didn't push rigid packages like the big firms. Diane tailored every contract. Some companies just needed help restructuring compensation. Others needed someone to mediate union disputes. She understood that clients didn't want an AI-powered bundle. They wanted real people, real work, real results. 3. Use silent leverage. Diane never disclosed that she had sensitive Orion documents, but she knew the old system inside and out, who'd been mistreated, who was disgruntled, which unions were on edge. When a manufacturing firm in Akron ran into trouble over a new layoff policy pushed by Orion, Diane reached out with a better solution and signed a contract by the end of the week. 3 months in, Phoenix HR had 5 official clients and $80,000 in revenue, not a headline-making figure, but a small miracle for a startup with no investors, no marketing team, and just one middle-aged woman once dismissed as past her prime. Emily, her daughter, began helping her manage the calendar, write content for the website, and build a proper LinkedIn page. Their living room became a second operations center, with a whiteboard covered in handwritten goals. June, sign 2 new clients. September, hire 1 associate. December, win back a major account from Orion. And then, word got around. Orion was losing clients. Long-standing contracts, some running 5 to 10 years, were suddenly being reviewed. Their new HR leadership team kept turning over. Jared, the man who had fired Diane, was reportedly being questioned by the board over declining consulting revenue in the Midwest. Diane didn't celebrate. She just drew another line on her planning board. 2024, reclaim Ohio market share. The real game was just beginning. Even as Phoenix HR found its footing, Diane quickly learned that starting a business at 51 wasn't like doing it in your prime. There was no safety net, no assistant, and definitely no buffer to absorb the market's punches. Every email, every failed pitch, every financial misstep, she owned it all. She was alone. Many nights, Diane stayed up until 2 or 3 a.m., combing through contracts, tweaking slide decks, double-checking small business tax forms, tasks she used to delegate, now handled solo. Some nights, she ate instant noodles while adjusting a PowerPoint presentation for a pitch the next morning in front of a local business council in Cleveland. Emily would sometimes tell her to go to bed, but Diane just smiled. You go ahead, honey. I'm almost done. Prejudice. During one meeting with a logistics company's executive board in Dayton, a sharply dressed young man cut her off mid-sentence. Are you sure you're up to date on modern HR tech? I mean, your resume says you started in HR. What? 27 years ago. Diane didn't flinch. But driving home, she gripped the steering wheel tightly. Comments like that, not overtly insulting, but loaded with judgment, reminded her exactly why she refused to go back to being an employee. The American business world, for all its talk of progress, still didn't easily make room for middle-aged women, especially those without a flashy corporate pedigree or the latest tech certifications. Money. The seed funding from Larry would keep things afloat for about 6 months. But Diane knew, if she didn't scale quickly, she'd have to start dipping into her personal savings, the same savings she'd continued. A single mother never wants to touch her savings, especially not when her daughter is just starting her career. Doubt. Some mornings, Diane would wake up, look in the mirror, and ask herself, am I doing the right thing? Or is this just someone refusing to accept that her time has passed? She was no longer the 30-year-old woman with the energy to work 12-hour days, but she also wasn't ready to sit around and wait for retirement. The question wasn't, am I tired? It was, is this worth it? And then, on a gray Wednesday, Diane got a phone call from a major client she'd long hoped to win back from Orion. We need to change our HR consulting firm. They don't understand our employees like they used to, the representative said. Diane took a deep breath. We could get started as early as next week. The moment she hung up, Diane burst into tears, not out of joy, but because she knew all the effort, all the sacrifice was finally starting to pay off. That October, Phoenix HR signed a contract with Midwest Trans, one of the largest logistics companies in the Midwest. A client Orion had held onto for 12 years. This wasn't just a contract worth over $240,000 a year. It was confirmation. Diane was no longer a former HR manager starting over late in life. She was reclaiming the market with her expertise and credibility. At the first meeting between Phoenix HR and the Midwest Trans management team, the CEO spoke bluntly. We're tired of pretty slides from people who don't understand who our employees actually are. We need someone who's worked with people, not just algorithms. Diane smiled. Then you found the right person. She began by overhauling the entire performance evaluation system, ditching bloated metrics and replacing them with a two-way feedback loop where both employees and managers could contribute transparently. 3 months in, turnover dropped by 18%. On-time deliveries increased by 11%. Word traveled fast in Ohio's HR circles. Because HR isn't a vast world, it's more like an underground network where everyone knows who's doing what. And the name Diane Thompson, once cast aside, was being whispered again in closed-door meetings. She started a new firm. She's pulling clients from Orion. I heard she has records on how Orion handled last year's layoffs. Phoenix HR? They actually deliver. No fluff. And then came the fateful phone call. Jared, the same man who had once coldly fired Diane, was now the executive VP for Orion's Northeast division. He'd just been reassigned back to Columbus to stabilize the market. He called Diane. We should talk, Jared said, trying to keep a neutral tone. Diane replied, about what? I'm not your employee anymore. No. But you're taking my clients. Diane laughed. I'm not taking anyone. They're leaving you and coming to me. Jared fell silent. She continued. If you need change management consulting, Phoenix HR offers that. But I charge by the hour. The call ended, and for the first time in years, Diane felt like she held the upper hand not out of revenge, but because she had survived and risen within the very system that once discarded her. By early 2023, at Orion's headquarters in downtown Columbus, tension filled the strategic planning room. HR consulting revenue in the Midwest had dropped by over 30% in less than 9 months. The internal reports listed the primary cause in one short line: the unexpected rise of Phoenix HR. Jared, now demoted to regional director, couldn't hide his frustration every time Diane's name came up. In a meeting with the executive board, he finally admitted, we're not losing clients because of pricing or technology. We're losing them because we underestimated something we used to take for granted: trust. Orion launched a counterattack. Slashed prices on HR consulting packages, even offering the first 3 months free. Launched media campaigns highlighting their cutting-edge AI-powered HR tech to revamp their image. Reached out to old clients, offering service guarantees and compensation if KPIs weren't met. But Diane had seen it coming months ahead. She wasn't playing the same game. While Orion was spending their budget trying to buy back market share, Diane was using human connection and real-world results to build loyalty. Instead of advertising on LinkedIn, she showed up at niche industry workshops where actual HR directors shared pain points, compared notes, and looked for solutions that worked. One day in March, Phoenix HR was invited to a private conference for HR leaders from manufacturing companies across the Great Lakes region. It used to be Orion's turf for a decade, but this time, Diane was the keynote speaker. Topic: Rebuilding Trust in the Age of HR Automation. Diane stepped onto the stage calmly, without flashy PowerPoint slides, just an old notebook and a few handwritten notes. She began with her story, how she was fired, how she was told she was obsolete, and how she realized that no technology could ever replace the value of truly understanding people. The room was silent. After her talk, 5 companies approached her. 3 of them were current Orion clients. As for Jared, he ordered an internal review on Phoenix HR. But the deeper they looked, the harsher the truth became. Diane hadn't broken a single legal clause. Phoenix HR was operating transparently and effectively. And worst of all, she still had access to Orion's old records, including meeting notes, layoff policies, and forced negotiation memos. If that information were ever made public, Orion's reputation in the Midwest could completely collapse. Diane didn't need to make threats. Her presence, calm, steady, and growing stronger by the day, was the declaration of war. And this time, Orion wasn't up against an employee. They were up against a formidable competitor, forged in the fire of their own past mistakes. In April 2023, just as Phoenix HR secured 3 more major clients from Orion, an emergency meeting was held at Orion's headquarters. The numbers were no longer a warning. They were the death knell for Orion's Midwest HR consulting division. Inside Orion, rumors began to circulate. Phoenix HR was preparing to release an independent report titled Behind the Numbers about unethical and opaque post-pandemic layoff practices in major corporations. The author? A former HR executive with over 20 years of experience at Orion. And the name on the signature line? Diane Thompson. The draft of the report didn't name any specific companies, but anyone in the industry could read between the lines. Mass layoffs conducted without offering any psychological support. Employees coerced into signing voluntary resignation forms to avoid severance packages. Outsourcing deals that replaced American workers with overseas contractors without any prior notice. And worst of all, internal meeting recordings kept by Diane herself. Not for revenge, but because she had once been the one defending employees and knew she needed proof when forced into political showdowns. The rumors spread like wildfire across the HR community on LinkedIn and professional forums. Every day, Phoenix HR's posts racked up hundreds of shares, mostly from HR professionals who had once felt suffocated in toxic corporate environments. Conferences began inviting Diane as a guest of honor. HR Today published an article titled, "The Woman Labeled Outdated is Now Forcing HR to Rethink Itself." Orion's reaction? Total internal crisis. Legal demanded a review of every HR document from the last 10 years. Jared was suspended to assist with an internal investigation. A PR team was hastily assembled to launch a brand refresh campaign, too little, too late. In a leaked internal email, one executive wrote, "We underestimated Diane. And now we're paying the price." As for Diane, she never released the full report. Instead, she launched a webinar series called HR Rehumanized, where she shared strategies to help companies rebuild fairer, more empathetic workplaces and avoid the same mistakes Orion had made. Her guests? Veteran HR leaders, labor attorneys, and most importantly, people who had been unfairly laid off, now rebuilding their careers with Phoenix HR's support. Diane's counterattack wasn't sensational. It was precise. It was ethical. And it was undeniable. When a reporter asked her, "Do you plan to sue Orion?" Diane just smiled. "I don't need a courtroom to speak the truth. I just need people to listen." By the end of 2024, Phoenix HR moved its headquarters from a quaint old house on North High Street in Columbus to a brand new 3-story building in Grandview Heights, a symbol of astonishing growth in just 2 years. With over 47 mid-sized and large businesses signed on for full-service contracts, Phoenix HR was no longer a small but different kind of company. They were redefining what modern HR should be. Diane no longer had to do everything herself. She'd built a team of HR experts, labor lawyers, workplace psychologists, and others who had once been cast aside, like she was, but who never lost their passion for the work. They didn't just provide services, they retrained the displaced, helping them return to the job market stronger and more prepared. Every month, Phoenix HR hosted a free online seminar for HR professionals who felt lost in the increasingly robotic world of modern business. They didn't spend on flashy ads. They built their brand on trust and results. On the Work Reimagined podcast, the host asked, "What makes Phoenix HR different?" Diane didn't talk about business models. She told her story. "I was let go for being outdated. But what I carried with me from the old days was loyalty, listening, and real human emotion, the very things many companies have lost in their race toward algorithms. I'm not against technology. I just want to remind people that human resources means people." That answer went viral. Young startups began using Phoenix HR as a model to build deeper, more ethical HR strategies. Universities in Ohio and Michigan invited Diane to speak to students majoring in human resources. She became a source of inspiration, something she never thought she could be. As for Orion, it's just a name now. They still exist, but their credibility is shattered. Many of their best people have left. Some joined Phoenix HR, others started companies of their own. Jared, the man who once fired Diane coldly. The man who once fired Diane is no longer in the industry. What he left behind is nothing more than a cautionary tale about arrogance and the disregard for human dignity. Phoenix HR didn't just reclaim market share. They reclaimed trust. And Diane, once dismissed at 51 as being past her prime, now stood as the face of a second generation in human resources, seasoned, thoughtful, and deeply attuned to what truly matters. The success of Phoenix HR led many to believe Diane was living her golden years. But behind the spotlight was a deeply American solitude, quiet, profound, and hard to share. At 53, Diane lived alone in a small apartment in German Village, where the streets were paved in red brick and the mornings smelled of old cafes she'd visit every Saturday. Every evening, after the office lights were off and her team had gone home, Diane would drive alone through the quiet streets, turn on NPR or an old Norah Jones jazz CD, and let the night unfold. She'd often glance at a small photo frame on her desk, just her and her daughter, now living in California. "You need to stop worrying about me, Mom. I need space to explore." That was during her daughter's first year of college, and since then, their calls had become less frequent. Diane once had a relationship that lasted nearly a decade with a former colleague. But when she chose to quit her job to care for her aging mother, that partner chose not to stay. "I can't stand still while you keep stepping back," he had said. It was a gentle sentence, but it left a wound that didn't heal easily. Her mother passed away in 2022, leaving Diane in a quiet emptiness, no longer a daughter, no longer hearing that nightly question. "Have you eaten, sweetheart?" And just months later, Diane herself was let go. The pain piled on. But Diane didn't cry. She was part of that 1970s generation of American women raised to be independent, self-reliant, and never to burden others with feelings. But one night, after a successful webinar, back in her apartment, she opened her phone and found a voice message from her daughter. "Mom, I just read your interview on LinkedIn. I had no idea you went through all that. I'm so proud of you. I miss you." Diane cried, not loudly, just a soft, silent trembling of the shoulders, like a thin sheet of ice finally cracking after years of cold. Success doesn't heal every wound, but it gives you a reason to keep moving. Diane realized that her greatest victory wasn't beating Orion. It was surviving the feeling of being left behind. She had learned how to live with emptiness, not by filling it with work, but by learning to accept it. And that's when Diane began thinking about something greater. If I can get back up after all that loss, how many others out there are still waiting for a hand to pull them up? Phoenix HR wasn't just a company. For Diane, It had become a mission, one that turned pain into possibility and reminded those who had been cast aside that they still mattered. Early 2025. Phoenix HR had just secured a strategic contract with a major logistics firm in Chicago. The media now referred to Diane as the woman redefining HR in the American Midwest. But just when everyone thought she was thriving, Diane began to feel hollow. Everything became mechanical. Back-to-back meetings, interview requests, emails to answer, articles to review. She started waking up early without the energy to get out of bed. She drank coffee but no longer noticed its familiar bitterness. During a keynote in Cleveland, standing before more than 300 people, Diane suddenly froze. The speech was memorized. The slides were advancing in order. But her voice wavered. "I'm sorry. I need a moment." It was the first time she had ever paused mid-presentation in over 30 years in the profession. Days later, during an internal strategy meeting, a young employee proposed changes to the onboarding process to better suit Gen Z hires. It was a sensible suggestion. But Diane, usually a champion of innovation, reacted unexpectedly. "We can't just keep changing everything just because a new generation walks in the door." Her voice was sharper than usual. The room went quiet. And in that very moment, Diane realized she was tired. Not from the work, but because she had never truly stopped. That night, she sat in her bathtub, playing Beethoven's Symphony No. 7 on low volume, the same piece her mother used to listen to near the end of her life. She remembered her mother's words. Being strong doesn't always mean moving forward. Sometimes, strength is knowing when to stop and breathe. And for the first time in years, Diane asked herself, if I stepped away now, would anyone understand? Would anyone blame me? And more importantly, could I forgive myself? The next morning, she sent an email to her team. "I'll be taking a 2-week leave. Going away. No laptop." No one complained. They replied with well wishes and a photo of the team holding up a hand-drawn sign. "We've got this. Take care, Diane." On the overnight train from Columbus to Denver, a place she'd once dreamed of visiting but never had the chance, Diane leaned her head against the window, watching the lights fade across the American plains. No strategy. No agenda. Just a woman learning how to give herself permission to be soft. Because sometimes, to truly lead others, you have to relearn how to love yourself first. Denver in March was colder than Diane had imagined. Snow still clung to the slopes, and the pine trees stood deep green against the gray sky. She rented a small wooden cabin at the edge of Rocky Mountain National Park. No internet, no phone. On the first day, she slept until noon. On the second, she walked along trails covered in dry leaves. By the third day, she simply sat on the porch, brewed a cup of hot tea, and wrote by hand in an old leather-bound journal. "I used to think winning meant keeping everything. But maybe growing up is knowing what to let go." One rainy afternoon, Diane met a woman named Laura in her early 40s, a reclusive artist who had once left her role as a marketing director in Austin to paint and teach art to local kids. They sat by the fireplace, sipping hot cocoa and sharing life stories. Diane talked about Phoenix HR, about Orion, about her mother, and about the years she had drained herself in the name of dedication. Laura listened quietly, then said, "Maybe you built a company, but that doesn't mean you have to carry it for life. Sometimes the best thing we can do for the child we create is to let it grow up without us." That sentence stirred something in Diane. She remembered why she'd started Phoenix HR, not to prove herself, but to build a place of dignity for those who'd been dismissed. And she realized she'd been repeating an old pattern, taking on too much, believing no one else could do it right. She had saved Phoenix HR from crisis. But now, Phoenix HR deserved a chance to breathe without her. When she returned to Columbus 2 weeks later, Diane gathered the leadership team. Not to check in, but to hand over the reins. "I'm stepping back. Not quitting, but no longer leading from the front. I'd like to create a rotating leadership council, and I'll serve as a strategic advisor, 2 days a week. The rest of the time, I want to live." The room was silent for a few seconds. Then came applause. A young staff member teared up and said, "Thank you for trusting us. And thank you for showing us how to work without losing ourselves." Diane didn't retire. She simply chose to live with intention. On weekends, she hosted small workshops at the city library, doing HR with heart. Sometimes she blogged. Not for fame, just to stay connected with those still lost, as she once had been. And every Saturday morning, she returned to her old cafe, ordered a cappuccino, and wrote by hand. "I'm still here. Not because I need to win, but because I choose to stay as myself." At a Chicago conference on restructuring HR in the age of AI and multi-generational workforces, Phoenix HR had been invited as a pioneer in the field. Though no longer the face of the company, Diane still attended, this time as an advisor, a symbolic presence. She wore a simple charcoal gray suit, her hair cut short, black-rimmed glasses, the look of a woman who'd weathered storms and no longer needed anyone's validation. While chatting with a group of HR professionals from Boston, she heard a familiar voice behind her. "I didn't expect to see you here, Diane." She turned. It was Eric Dalton, the man who'd once replaced the former CEO at Orion, and the same one who had coldly fired her 3 years ago with the words, "Your thinking no longer fits the times." Eric looked different now. Same expensive suit, but his hair was visibly graying, eyes shadowed, forehead lined from stress. He was now consulting for a small HR startup on the West Coast, and few seemed to notice he was even at the conference. Diane nodded without flinching. "Hello, Eric. I heard you're helping some HR startups now. I hope this time you're actually listening to your teams." Eric gave a tight smile. "I didn't think you'd bounce back so fast." A lot of people said Phoenix HR wouldn't last. Diane smiled, not bitterly, just as if recalling an old story. A lot of people said that. And a lot of people forget they only ever saw 10% of what I really had in me. He was quiet. She continued. "Files, networks, industry insights, I didn't use them to get revenge. I used them to build. Maybe that's the difference between you and me." After a moment, Eric lowered his gaze slightly. "I misjudged you. Maybe. I lost a resource I never really knew how to use." Diane looked at him, not gloating, not pitying, and answered gently. "The issue was never whether I had value. The issue was that you didn't have the vision to see it." Their conversation ended when the event moderator invited Diane to the stage. She walked up to the sound of applause. Eric stood motionless among the crowd, facing, perhaps for the first time, the consequences of a decision he'd made years ago. This wasn't revenge. It was proof that no one gets to decide your worth, except you. Diane stood beneath the stage lights, hair a bit tousled in the glow. But her confidence didn't come from the spotlight. It came from the quiet power of growth. She had endured enough to know she belonged here. Not for glory, but because she wanted everyone in that room to understand. Success isn't just about numbers. It's about how you live with yourself. She picked up the mic, offered a soft smile, and said, "Hello, everyone. I'm Diane, and today I want to talk about something we don't often discuss at conferences like this: pain and recovery." She paused, scanning the room, faces attentive, people leaning in to hear every word. 3 years ago, I was fired from the company I had dedicated nearly my entire life to. I was called outdated, no longer relevant. And none of us ever forget what it feels like to be left behind. But I didn't get back up just to prove them wrong. I got back up because I realized I was the only one who could decide how I would live. Diane shared the story of the difficult months that followed her dismissal, the sleepless nights, the bold, risky decisions she had to make to rebuild her career from scratch. But more than any of the victories, she emphasized not losing herself in the process. With Phoenix HR, I didn't just build a company. I rebuilt myself. And to me, that's what real success looks like. She went on to talk about the core values of Phoenix HR: honoring people, encouraging creativity, and accepting failure as an essential part of growth. I won't deny that every strategy, every plan, involves a bit of luck. But what matters most is whether we're willing to face ourselves after each failure. Every time I fell, I asked myself, do I still believe in what I'm doing? And if the answer was yes, I stood back up. She paused again, this time letting the silence fill the space before she continued. The light from the stage cast a gentle glow on her face, her eyes shining with clarity and determination. She smiled. And when you believe in yourself, when you stop letting fear and failure pull you down, that's when you truly start living. The entire room was still. And then the applause erupted. The audience stood, not just for the strategies she had shared, but for the deeper truth she had delivered, a story of starting over from nothing, of courage not just in business, but in life itself. Diane didn't need to reclaim market share or beat anyone to feel victorious. She had found her true triumph in being herself and no longer being afraid of change. As the lights dimmed and the applause faded, she knew that today, she hadn't just shared a success story. She had inspired people facing their own challenges and shown them that you are never too old to start again. One autumn morning, Diane sat in her office at Phoenix HR, gazing out the window at the lush garden beyond. She wasn't in charge anymore, but the company was still growing, and that made her proud. She had found a way to move through challenges without losing herself. She looked at the old wooden desk, still scattered with important documents, but no longer weighed down by the heavy pressures of the past. She had shared her power, trusted her team, and helped them grow. There was a time I thought I had to do everything myself, that I had to be the only one making decisions. But now I understand, when you empower others, when you trust them, you're giving them the chance to grow. And that's what success really is. Diane didn't need to prove anything anymore. The standing ovation at the conference had been moving, but even more meaningful was the change she'd made in her own life. She had learned that freedom wasn't about avoiding responsibility. It was about being able to live true to herself, without sacrificing who she was for anyone else. In the quiet late afternoons, she still took walks in the park near her home, watching the wide open fields and the kids laughing in the distance. Those were the moments she realized life wasn't a race. It was a journey of coming back to yourself. She wondered if, over the course of her life, she had ever truly dared to live fully. And then she understood, only now, when she no longer had to keep up, no longer had to prove anything, was she truly living. She could love herself. She could honor what she had done. And she could look back without regret. Diane smiled softly. The revenge she had once imagined wasn't about tearing down the people who had pushed her out. It was about living a life she fully owned. I don't need to prove I was right. I only need to prove I can live freely, true to who I am. And that is the greatest victory. She stood, looked out the window once more, not seeing a path she had to conquer, but a vast open sea of possibility. A place where she could breathe and move forward, not to achieve something, but simply because she had the right to choose her own path. Diane had learned one of life's most important lessons. Freedom isn't about control or conquest. It's about living true to yourself and cherishing what you already have. In the end, Diane no longer needed recognition or success in the way the world defines it. She had created a space for herself, a life that honored her values. And in doing so, she had found everything she truly needed, freedom in her spirit and peace in her heart. The story ends here, but Diane's journey, a woman who rose from pain and adversity, who found her way back to herself and ultimately built a life of freedom and wholeness, will continue to inspire anyone seeking change and a life lived authentically. With this chapter, Diane's story closes in a meaningful way, delivering a powerful message about freedom and how we all have the strength to find it within ourselves, no matter the challenges we face. Of the peace Diane could never seem to find when she was caught in the endless grind of her old life. Now, she spent her days tending to her small garden, a simple joy she'd never had time for before. The trees, the flowers, the stillness of the morning helped her feel deeply connected to nature and to herself. She also began taking yoga classes in the afternoons, where she learned to listen to her body and calm her mind. These sessions didn't just improve her health, they became moments of quiet reflection, moments that grounded her. In a world full of noise and busyness, she realized stillness was the most precious thing she could give herself. But what Diane cherished the most was the deepening bond with her daughter. In the past, work had stolen much of their time together. Now, every weekend, the two would go for walks, explore city parks, or simply sit in a cafe, talking about the little things in life. "Mom, you seem so much happier now," her daughter once said with a radiant smile. "You've found what really matters, haven't you?" Diane looked at her daughter and smiled gently. She knew that, even though her company had succeeded and her bank account was comfortable, none of that truly mattered anymore. What she had been searching for all along were these quiet, heartfelt moments, the love and connection of family. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, Diane looked around and felt a deep warmth in her heart. She no longer felt like something was missing. Her career no longer defined her priorities. Instead, what mattered were her loved ones, the simple joys, and the ability to truly live in the present. She had found peace, not in material success, not in achievements or recognition, but in learning to accept herself, in giving time to what mattered most, and in living a life that felt right to her, not dictated by societal expectations or anyone else's approval. Diane realized that no matter how much life changed, she had learned to create happiness from within. She was no longer a relentless warrior in the workplace. She was a woman savoring each moment, embracing self-love and sharing genuine care with those around her. And that, she knew, was the most precious gift life could give her. Diane's story ends here, but the journey toward peace and living authentically continues in each of us. We can all learn something from her story, that true freedom isn't about control or conquering the world. It's about mastering ourselves and finding peace in our own hearts.